Good day and welcome virtually to the Canada School of Public Service. My name is Neil Bauer. I'll be the moderator for today's discussion, and I'm the Vice President of Innovation and Policy Services at the Canada School of Public Service. Donc bonjour et bienvenue virtuellement.
So welcome virtually to the Public Service School of Canada. I'm Neil Bauer. I will be your moderator for today's discussion. I'm Vice President of the Innovation Services branch at the Public Service School.
That I'm in Ottawa right now, so that puts me on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people.
So since I'm here in Ottawa, I'm on the traditional unceded territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Since we're working in different places, we are on different indigenous territories. So I would like you to take a moment to reflect and recognize the territory, the traditional territory where you work.
Produce today's event. It's entitled The Role of the Public Service in Building and Promoting Trust. Donc, le rôle de la fonction publique.
Confiance, the role of the public service in creating an atmosphere of confidence.
You all to this event. In order to have the best possible experience for this virtual event, first of all, we encourage you to connect from your VPN if possible, and then reconnect to the event without your VPN turned on. That will help with the connectivity and the video. Secondly, there is simultaneous interpretation available for this event. You will have seen that when you first logged into the meeting. So I invite you to select the language of your choice so that as we have French and English on the event, you'll be able to follow along. Throughout the event, we welcome your questions. So you can click on a little icon that looks like a raised hand, and there is time at the end for a question and answer period. So by clicking on that hand, you're not giving away your name or anything like that. You're just giving you the opportunity to submit a question, which will come to us, and we'll be able to put it to our panel. Donc, tout au long de l'événement, vous pouvez...
So you can ask your questions throughout by clicking on the icon. It looks like a raised hand. So there will be a question and answer period at the end.
For joining us in this second event on trust in the public service. I think we can all agree that trust has always been important. So in the governing of a country, in the building of communities, in the conduct of business, trust has always been important. But historically, big business, governments, the federal government, media, and others have taken that trust for granted, and they could take that trust for granted because society looked to these big players for trust. But now, information comes to us in different ways from many different sources. And there are many more voices in society, in our political space, in the economy. And so no one needs to rely on any one source. There are many more sources of truth. So I don't know how many people out there amongst us still listen to traditional television stations and watch big broadcasting and get their information about the world through highly curated news authorities, but surely that number is diminishing. And most of us now get what we know about the world from many different sources at many different times, and also from other citizens, whether it's on social media or through other means. So in fact, this is very empowering for citizens, and that's good. But it can also undermine those institutions that were relied upon and trusted sources of truth and information. On top of it all, we have populism, which can be accompanied by anti-expert voices who may be self-interested or not, but who do undermine trust in institutions. Moreover, in a digital economy and society where we are data-driven and evidence-based and knowledge-driven, it is often said that business moves at the speed of trust, that trust is fundamental to well-functioning modern organizations. So whether we're talking about health guidance, whether we're talking about elections, election results, and the peaceful transfer of power, whether we're talking about business trends or law and order, trust is absolutely essential. We know that from the Edelman Trust Index from last year, that in fact, there are continued reasons to be concerned about the levels of trust in government and other institutions. In fact, one quote from that report is that the era of information bankruptcy and a trust, we're in an era of information bankruptcy, and we have a trust ecosystem unable to confront it. And more recently, Edelman quoted the need for trust during a pandemic and talked about the infodemic, and that just when we need trust the most, we have reasons to be concerned. So today's topic is about misinformation and disinformation, and so there are actors that are working either expressly or not, but to undermine trust in some of those basic societal questions. So really pleased today to have two great experts in the area of trust and public service colleagues who are working in this area. First of all, we have Sarah Stinson, who's the Director of Operations at the Democratic Institutions Secretariat of the Privy Council Office. In this role, she leads a team to protect and advance Canada's interests in its democratic institutions. She's been doing this role for since the before the pandemic. And she, before that, was leading a DM established task team at Natural Resources Canada to deliver on clean energy ministerial and the innovation work of that department. So welcome, Sarah. We also have Owen Ripley, who's the Director General of Broadcasting, Copyright and Creative Marketplace at Canadian Heritage. He leads a number of teams responsible for providing advice relating to the Broadcasting Act, Copyright Act, CBC, and for our purposes, really about disinformation and about other online harms. And so he also manages the Canada Media Fund and the federal government's contribution there too. And he has been a leader in this space for some time, including during the review of the Broadcasting Act. Really pleased to have both of you here today. Thank you very much. I think the way we'll do this is we'll just ask each of our guests in turn to give a short introduction of themselves and of the issue, talk about what they know in this area, and then I am going to ask a few questions that I have to tease more out of our guests, and then we're going to open it up to you. So that any questions that you have can feel free to type them in any time, and we'll collect them up and ask our guests those in turn. So Sarah, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, merci, Neil, and thank you everybody for offering me the opportunity to outline a little bit of what we do at the Democratic Institutions Secretariat around the issues of trust and protecting our democratic institutions. So over the next few minutes, I'll touch on a couple of points, specifically the role of the Democratic Institutions Secretariat and how our minister, the President of the Queen's Privy Council of Canada, delivers on his mandate, and as well what we have done so far with respect to combating disinformation. So as Neil mentioned, the Edelman Trust Barometer of this year found that indeed COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to an erosion of trust around the world. And that trust in information sources of all kinds, whether it's traditional media to social media, is at a record low level. That said, at this time, there is a little bit of reason to be optimistic, cautious optimism, I would say, in Canada. A recent report from the Samara Center for Democracy included a number of findings that put Canada outside the general worldwide trend of declining trust. Indeed, the report found that public confidence in Canadian democracy and public institutions has actually increased a little bit during the pandemic, 21 to 24 points for federal and provincial governments, respectively. And while these results are from May 2020, and obviously a lot of time has passed since then, and that was fairly early in the pandemic, I think that they do provide us with an initial understanding of how Canadians responded to government action during the pandemic. Importantly, though, these findings should not allow us or enable us to rest on our laurels and hope that Canadians will continue to have this kind of high level of trust in government and our democracy. We have to constantly be proving to Canadians that we're worthy of their trust and are working for them in this regard. So in terms of the Democratic Institutions Secretariat, We're housed within the Privy Council Office, and we work to support Minister LeBlanc as President of the Queen's Privy Council for Canada and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Democratic Institutions is a small team of about 12 people, and we operate a little bit like a mini government. And so as we talk about the importance of partnerships later on, I think that that is particularly important for us. So within democratic institutions, we're responsible for providing policy advice to the minister on issues related to, among other things, Canada's efforts to protect its democracy, the Canada Elections Act, and the Leaders' Debates Commission, all of which tie back, I think, to the issue of trust that we're addressing here this afternoon. So the work that's being undertaken in a way brings together government partners from across the spectrum. This includes partners in our security agencies. It includes colleagues like Owen in Canadian Heritage and Elections Canada, our independent election administration body. And I think we saw that in advance of the 2019 federal election, this collaborative effort was really demonstrated in the Protecting Democracy plan that was put in place to safeguard those elections and our democratic institutions more broadly. Democratic Institutions Secretariat also brings together non-government partners. So for example, under the leadership with Microsoft and the Alliance for Securing Democracy, we lead Principle 3 of the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, which focuses on defending electoral processes. And through this initiative and with these partners, we're aiming to bring together an international community of partners to protect election processes and counter malicious cyber activities like the spread of disinformation. We also work to support and strengthen our electoral system, including resilience to disinformation. And so we have in the past supported the government through the introduction of legislative measures into the Canada Elections Act to strengthen our electoral system and foster greater trust. Another way that the Democratic Institution Secretariat works to foster trust is through the standing up and the support we provide to the Leaders' Debates Commission. And so the commission, as you may know, produces debates in English and French during an election campaign to ensure that Canadians have a chance to hear directly from the people vying to run the country. Alors, le rôle du Secretariat pour soutenir le...
The role of the Secretariat in supporting the Privy Council as far as disinformation and initiatives put in place to fight disinformation. As you know, disinformation is a complex problem. It requires a lot of solutions. So it's about strengthening the resilience of citizens and giving Canadians access to quality information. And this is made possible through funding projects like those coming from Digital Citizenship Project. Owen will be getting more into this. As we mentioned, the Secretariat supports the President's work as far as improving the plan for protecting Canadian democracy. There was a plan put in place in 2019. One of the main elements of this plan relating to trust is work on major elections processes. You have the clerk. He's kept informed of issues in the news and can make an announcement if he thinks incidents can have a significant impact on Canada's capacity in organizing a free and fair elections. The nonpartisan nature of the committee is a key element in making sure that Canadians can hear these announcements. Canada's declaration on online processes is a commitment to make sure that those working on Twitter, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, that they put in increased efforts to fight disinformation as far as elections go. Let's also mention the role of Global Affairs Canada, responsible for the rapid response mechanism in the G7, allows Canada to work closely with partners at the international level to identify the content of information that could be damaging and finding ways to solve them.
How the Secretariat works to strengthen the electoral system and the work undertaken to address disinformation. At the same time, the government must always be careful to tread carefully to ensure that it's not infringing on people's freedom of expression, especially in a heated and emotional atmosphere such as an election. To balance these two needs, the Canada Elections Act had its provisions related to publishing false statements narrowed to information about criminal records and biographical information, as recommended by the Commissioner of Canada Elections. Additionally, the Canada Elections Act now prohibits the distribution of materials in an election in any form that are intended to mislead the public as to the source of the material. Finally, just to note that the Secretariat works closely with civil society organizations to support interesting projects aimed at learning more about how disinformation is spread and its impact. For example, one current project we've undertaken with the Samara Center for Democracy focuses on the use of digital communications tools by elected representatives to better reach their constituents. Especially in the time of the pandemic, these digital tools are more important than ever in building the relationship and fostering trust between communities and their elected representatives. This project will also include some public guides and civil society organizations and for civil society organizations and elected representatives on the best ways to use digital technologies to reach Canadians. So I'll stop there. But welcome the opportunity to address any further questions in that portion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Over to you, Owen.
Thanks, Neil, and hello, folks. It's a pleasure to be here with you today virtually alongside my colleague, Sarah, and to participate in this series on trust. So as Neil mentioned, I have the privilege of leading the team at Canadian Heritage responsible for broadcasting, copyright, and the creative marketplace. Our responsibilities include giving the minister advice with respect to Canada's broadcasting system, our copyright framework, CBC Radio Canada, and our largest television and digital media production fund, the Canada Media Fund. I'd say that the catchphrase of the last couple transition cycles has been digital disruption as we work to adapt programs and policies initially designed for a linear world. The most recent example that Neil alluded to is Bill C-10, an act to amend the Broadcasting Act, which was tabled by the minister before the holidays and proposes a much needed modernization of the Broadcasting Act to account for services like Netflix, Crave, TV, and Spotify. At the same time, the mandate of the branch has also expanded over the last few years to increasingly look at the impact of online disinformation and online harms on Canadian society. 2 years ago, as Sarah mentioned, in partnership with our colleagues at Democratic Institutions, we launched the Digital Citizen Initiative, or DCI for short, a new program designed to build citizen resilience against online disinformation and to support a healthy information ecosystem through partnerships with civil society and academia. The impact of the DCI has been significant, having funded over 100 projects from a diverse group of organizations and reaching millions of Canadians. You'll hear more about the DCI in a minute or two. We are also increasingly looking at how the government can play a role in advancing a more safe and inclusive online environment. The mandate letter junkies tuning in today will know that our minister has been tasked with, quote, creating new regulations for social media platforms, starting with a requirement that all platforms remove illegal content, including hate speech within 24 hours or face significant penalties. This should include other online harms such as radicalization, incitement to violence, exploitation of children, or creation or distribution of terrorist propaganda, end quote. The team is working hard to support the minister in tabling legislation to fulfill this mandate letter commitment. In several areas, therefore, the team is on the front lines of thinking about the appropriate role of government in regulating and influencing the digital public square. How can the digital public square reflect our values and priorities as Canadians, our cultures and identities? What is the appropriate role of government in equipping citizens to navigate contradictory information online and to support them in making informed decisions? How can the government help all Canadians feel safe in expressing themselves online, irrespective of their sexual identity, skin color, religion, or heritage, while also respecting our commitment to freedom of expression? And more broadly, how can the government tackle barriers that have excluded Indigenous peoples, Black people, and people of color from fully expressing themselves and fully participating in our institutions? Not easy questions, to say the least. The school asked me to talk about the department's Digital Citizen Initiative, so I want to circle back and talk a little bit more about how we got to where we are today. It's actually fitting that we are having today's discussion a day before tomorrow's inauguration in the US, because it was really that country's 2016 presidential elections that catapulted the phenomenon of disinformation to the forefront of our collective consciousness. While it's hard to remember, back then our collective understanding of the phenomenon was relatively limited. Outlets like BuzzFeed broke the story about Macedonian teenagers seeking to profit off peddling sensationalist stories about US politics. But at the department, we recognized a need to better understand the phenomenon and what it could mean for Canada. We realized that while disinformation was indeed resonating with citizens, the impact on their behavior was far less clear. Moreover, there was little to no understanding of disinformation in the Canadian context. What does it mean for English or French speakers or allophones? Does information spread differently in diaspora communities or among recent immigrants? What about youth or seniors or baby boomers? While we were asking ourselves these questions, our colleagues at democratic institutions were gearing up to prepare for the 2019 federal election and to put in place a series of measures to safeguard that election, both protecting it from foreign interference and to better equip citizens to navigate a much more complex information space. So the Digital Citizen Initiative was born in January 2019 as part of the Minister of Democratic Institutions' efforts to promote citizen resilience in the run-up to the 2019 election. The government invested $7 million in support of citizen-focused activities carried out by arm's-length organizations, things like youth programming, public awareness campaigns, training sessions for teachers, educators, and journalists, online resources, tools development, and events. Our assessment is that DCI-supported activities reached more than 12 million Canadians in the lead up to the federal election. All of these activities were delivered by independent, arm's-length organizations, and this third-party delivery is fundamental to the DCI, which starts with an understanding that government may not actually be the best vehicle for reaching Canadians, particularly those more skeptical of government. We were fortunate that Budget 2019 confirmed an additional investment in the DCI, which has since allowed us to pursue research activities to better understand disinformation in the Canadian context. We support both more pure research through a partnership with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, as well as more applied research through a grants and contributions program. The idea behind this has been to foster community of practice with the objective of, over time, refining tools and interventions to more directly address the needs and vulnerabilities of particular Canadian communities. I will close out by talking briefly about how we leveraged the DCI during the pandemic. Early on at the start of COVID, around the end of February 2020, the team observed a rise in both health-related disinformation online, as well as disinformation with racist overtones, particularly directed towards individuals of Asian descent. The team thought about how we created this new program and worked to develop a community of practice, and that we were likely well placed to lean into the groundswell of health-related disinformation that we were witnessing. So with the support of our Deputy Minister and Minister, the department risk managed $3 million, or approximately $3 million in grants and contributions funding that allowed us to be in the field by mid-March. Through a targeted call for proposals, we reached out to 10 organizations and asked them to think about how they might help Canadians think more critically about COVID-19 disinformation. And in early April, the minister made an announcement to this effect. We followed it up in the summer by an additional open call for proposals that sought to amplify existing projects that were already in the field, but where a little bit more funding could help them go that extra mile and take their project to the next level. We funded an additional 24 projects. What has struck me about our COVID work has been the diversity of organizations that have stepped forward. In addition to digital and media literacy organizations that we would expect, we've seen community organizations, museums and science centers, city and municipal governments, radio stations, and newspaper associations all put up their hand. Before the holidays, I had the opportunity to participate in an OECD call talking about various governments' communications responses to COVID. I was the only non-comms person on the panel, and most of my fellow panelists described a highly centralized strategic comms approach to addressing COVID-related disinformation. The decentralized example of the Digital Citizen Initiative was a pretty stark contrast. And that's a good segue to my final thought. We're talking about trust, and specifically trust in government today. But I would say that one of the lessons of the DCI is that instilling this trust may mean accepting that government is not always best placed to do the thing that we want to do, a reality that I would argue is quite acute in the information space. There will inevitably be Canadians who, for whatever reason, are distrustful of government or who are more isolated. And here I question the effectiveness of government messaging in reaching the unreached, so to speak. The DCI is a modest example of us trying to better understand how disinformation spreads and its impact on particular communities, and then to work with organizations better placed than us, dare I say more trusted than us, to combat its effects. So I'll end there, Neil, turn it back over to you, and welcome the discussion.
Thank you, Owen. So interesting. Thank you to both of you for giving us a flavor of what your organizations are up to. In both cases, it sounds to me like there's a lot of interesting activity and a lot of partners to be managed and priorities to be managed. Really interesting, and I'd love to delve into this a little bit more now, I guess, with Q&As. Let me just remind everyone, though, please do submit your questions by using the raised hand icon. Donc, pour nos apprenants,
So we can go for questions, and I invite you to submit your questions by using the raised hand icon.
The work of this democratic institution secretariat in this area is intriguing. It sounds new. You mentioned a few external stakeholders and partners that you work with. I wonder, first of all, if you could just say a little bit more about what different players can and are doing to help kind of stitch together the information ecosystem, but also if there are any other options we should be thinking about, if there are any other types of partnerships or policy instruments that we should be thinking about. Be really great to hear some of your thoughts.
Apologies, there we go, unmuted. Absolutely, thank you, Neil. And I think, that the issue of partnership and how we need to leverage the expertise, the connectedness that partners, whether it's across the federal public service or in communities or in academia, is absolutely necessary. Each of those players has a critical role to play in that information ecosystem that you mentioned and that Owen mentioned, whether it's traditional media, social media platforms, academia, civil society, and government, of course, as well. One of the key partnerships that we have been involved in and that Canada has been co-leading, I mentioned at the outset, is the Paris Call Principle 3 around defending electoral processes. And we're working with Microsoft and the Alliance for Securing Democracy to look at best practices and lessons learned in this particular space. Over the course of sort of May, the end of May, when Minister Leblanc announced our co-leadership to just before the holidays, we organized with our partners a series of 6 workshops. Each of those workshops focused on a different element and area in terms of how to prevent interference and address information and empower citizens. I encourage people to look at the Democratic Institutions website, where what we've done is we've actually summarized some of the key findings from those workshops. because what we have tried to do is through each of those players in the ecosystem, where we brought them together from across from Europe, from the US, to look at sort of what some of those best practices are in terms of how can we build a healthy information ecosystem. So your second question was, what other options are open for the government to continue sort of combating this? I think, the trick here is, and I know Owen and I are of the same view, there's no one silver bullet to addressing this pervasive and I would say evolving challenge. I think we being in Canada, we're always committed to preserving and focusing and protecting Canadians' freedom of expression. Because we hold ourselves to the, sort of the highest standards of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But we've seen many examples of policies that have been implemented in other countries that could work in Canada or may not work in Canada. And so I think, as we continue to look at those options, we need to look around us, see what others are doing, what works in their context. And similarly to what we did with the Protecting Democracy Plan in 2019, create a made in Canada option that fits the Canadian context. And I think, we're always looking for those new options. And, as we continue to sort of see how things evolve and how social media platforms evolve, looking to see then what the government role is and how we can best support Canadians, in being resilient and being informed in that information space as sort of our role in that broader information ecosystem.
Fantastic, thank you. Next to you, Owen, you mentioned a lot of different players that the Digital Citizen Initiative deals with, which is amazing at different levels of government, regional, local, national. And at the same time, you mentioned the need for diversity as well. So just a question, as you're working on Digital Citizen, the initiative and doing grants and contributions and so on, how do you ensure, well, fairness and a lack of favoritism on funding decisions, but also a diversity of recipients?
Thanks, Neil. So a couple of points to highlight is one, we've been very intentional about the governance structure that we've put in place to guide the Digital Citizen Initiative, and as we put up recommendations to the minister about what projects to support. So we were very sensitive about the perception again of government acting by itself in this space. And so what we wanted to do is we created an interdepartmental working group that brought together a variety of folks across the town who are active in related issues or disinformation or digital or media literacy activities, so that they could feed in, and you're about to see my daughter. Great. Thanks.
Amazing, amazing.
I knew that was going to happen. You might not be the last time you see her. And so that was an opportunity to basically, acknowledge that many of us are working in this space, and to make sure that we're taking kind of decisions that reflect, the input of a variety of folks across town. The second thing that we did was we wanted to create an external steering committee that would be comprised of folks from outside government. So these are folks active in foundations, civil society, academia, who could, provide us, a flavor of kind of what they're seeing from where they sit, right? So anytime we do a call for proposals and are thinking about our funding decisions, we run those projects through both committees, and that's a way of kind of getting a diversity of perspectives on those various projects. We have also been very intentional about trying to fund projects that target communities where that may not be reached by kind of mainstream organizations. So we sought to make sure that we are reaching out to official language communities, official language minority communities, minority language communities where it may be a third language that is being spoken, about projects that are reaching out to Indigenous communities, projects that are looking at, again, and I kind of referenced this in my opening remarks about the particular impact on certain ethno-cultural communities. And so, the approach continues to evolve over time, but the goal is get to a place where we really recognize that, Owen, as a white male living in Ottawa, will not be susceptible to the same kinds of disinformation strategies as someone else, sitting in a different lived experience elsewhere in the country, and vice versa, right? And so the whole partnership model is designed to try to figure out, okay, so what is that organization that is going to reach Owen? What is that organization that may reach Sarah? Who are the trusted, voices that we are more inclined to kind of connect with and have that relationship with?
Interesting. I guess the sign of public policy maturity when you're dealing with the dynamics, not just sort of the one size fit all. So that's really profound, I think. I'm going to ask one of my questions, but I'm going to blend in one of the questions from one of our viewers. So the general question is just, how has COVID-19 changed the game? You both made allusions to COVID-19. So for you, Owen, how does it affect this digital citizen initiative, not to mention the other activities on misinformation and disinformation? And Sarah, for you, the same in your activities. And the question from the audience in particular is, has there been any work funded or proposed to address digital science literacy and misinformation or disinformation, thinking of the vaccines, for example, or about transmission of COVID-19? So maybe, Owen, I start with you this time, and then over to Sarah.
Donc c'est certain que...
Yes, indeed. We're trying. Work is being carried by our colleagues at Health Canada, our colleagues at Industry, Science and Innovation, who are trying to look closely at scientific literacy, science literacy. But as I said earlier, we've set up this interdepartmental committee, so everyone gets together there, and the idea is to group people so they can share their own expertise or experiences. So the committee was set up 2-3 years ago, and what we've noticed then is that there was not one approach, a strategic coordinated approach in the government. So Sarah's team did a good job before the election. Everyone was pulling together, and we were able to organize ourselves to take up the challenges of the election.
Relationships that were developed, by Sarah's team have continued and have started to mature, right? And so, it's actually getting to a place where we might, get a project that comes in through one of our call for proposals, and it's not quite right. It doesn't quite kind of meet kind of what we had put out, as a call, but it fits, say, more in with something that our colleagues at public safety are looking at, right? We also, were, in contact with our colleagues at ISED. Some of you may remember, there was a spat attacks against telecoms equipment, as there were concerns that 5G was reported to be causing a variety of different health effects, right? And so that was something that we worked with our colleagues at ISED to connect them with some of the organizations who might actually be well placed to pick up and respond to some of those types of disinformation that were circulating online. And so, I know our colleagues at ISED and Health and FAC are very seized with the science piece, and that's something that we're pursuing with them in terms of, again, thinking about how we all leverage what each of us can bring to the table.
Thanks, Owen. Sarah, anything to add?
Sure. I mean, I think, from our perspective, the pandemic has really shed a new light on the fact that disinformation not only continues to be an issue, because we see it obviously with respect to not just sort of election interference, but obviously with respect to vaccinations and health-related information. So it continues to be an evolving issue. And the tactics that we're seeing that are being employed in the COVID pandemic context, we need to look at those in terms of how might those be then applied in an election context. And so looking at how we can sort of take what's being done now and apply it to sort of the democratic space for which we are responsible. I think, too, it's sort of a reflection of how the threat of disinformation has evolved. And, what we've seen as well is that, at least in the electoral context, the primary focus was really on foreign interference and disinformation. And what we're seeing in the pandemic context is, we have to be very aware of that it's not just going to be foreign generated, but we have to be prepared to counter disinformation regardless of its origin. And I think too, again, the issue that really sort of is at the heart of the Digital Citizen Initiative that Owen and his team lead is ensuring that citizens are armed with tools to be able to defend themselves against disinformation, so that they have that media literacy, and that they are sort of the first defense with respect to sort of being able to identify factual information and engage constructively in sort of thought and debate in that space. So that's sort of what I've taken away with respect to the current situation.
And I would just, I think it's important to remember that for actors who are intentionally spreading disinformation or misinformation, right, that it's actually, likely more about undermining trust in various institutions, including government, driving polarization in terms of, our ability to, get along with one another. And so from that perspective, it's opportunistic, right? It's not actually, I don't think we're necessarily going to be able to kind of predict what the next issue will be that, folks, again, who are actively seeking to be in this space will try to use as a wedge, right? And again, we had, we didn't have any in December of 2019. We had no plans to do a call for proposals with respect to, again, health-related disinformation, right? But that had changed by February because, and again, the team actually deserves all the credit on this. They were the ones that said, look, we think this COVID thing is going to be bigger than we were thinking. We would perhaps be wise to actually start getting out and working with organizations, who are going to, work to address some of the disinformation and racist and stigmatization messaging that was starting to crop up.
Interesting. Well, so the questions are rolling in. So I'm going to cherry pick one and then another, and we'll proceed like that. The first question, and I think, Owen, maybe we'll start with you again, and then Sarah. The question is, should all voices be given an equal platform in social media and/or the news media? And the example that they give is anti-maskers. or other controversial information. So, we have for long protected the right of people to be heard, freedom of speech, and that, part of our approach to broadcasting has been to give people voice. So how do we decide now whether to give people equal platforms or whether to not, and how do we handle misinformation in this context?
Yeah, so it's a very hard question. And I mentioned some of the work that we're doing around putting in place a legislative regulatory framework to deal with, specifically illegal type content, right? I guess the work begins with an understanding, again, I think of, many of the positive things that, social media and an open internet bring to the table, right? In terms of, I think we all have appreciated these services, particularly in COVID, right? Opportunity to support discourse, right? Support public participation on these issues, the ability to, support local and smaller businesses. But we also know, and the rub of the problem is we also know that, they can be vectors for spreading, hatred, illegal type content, child sexual exploitation, as well as and misinformation. And I think the challenge for Canada, as it charts a course forward in this, is how do we uphold the charter in terms of respecting freedom of expression, respecting freedom of assembly, while at the same time, having a framework that articulates what our expectations of social media companies are, and how they deal with the speech that is taking place on their platforms. That's what the team's working through right now. I saw one of the other questions talk about, are there any other laws out there, examples of laws? We've seen some first movers in this space. So Germany is the one that's held up most frequently. It's Netzdige law, whereby, Germany requires, and again, the German experience is really informed too. We have to remember kind of it's in the post-World War context where, lots of sensitivity around anti-Semitic speech and those type of issues, right? And so what Germany did a number of years ago is put in place a framework where social media companies have to remove what they call manifestly illegal content, and it's in relation to a number of different criminal offenses in German law. So that is, the example that's most frequently held up internationally. I think the challenging space in this is, the question talks about, should all voices be given an equal platform? I guess from my perspective, it's how do you, again, respect an individual's right to express themselves, even when that speech may be hurtful or harmful to someone else, but also create a space online where folks feel safe to go and express themselves. And I think a little bit it's where the speech bit meets the technology bit, and how you deal with issues of the right to express yourself. It doesn't necessarily translate into, say, the ability for, or the right for something to go viral, for example, right? And so how do you use tools at our disposal to, again, educate people about something that they may be about to click on, or something that they're reading. And obviously, in the current climate, we've seen a lot more of those tools start to be, deployed. I'm sure all of us have now had the experience of seeing something on Twitter, and either you're about to share it and you haven't really read it, and it says, "Are you sure you want to share this?" before reading it, or being on Facebook and about to click on something, and a little message pops up saying, we're not sure this is accurate, right? And so we're seeing a lot more of those kind of tools being deployed.
It was interesting to see the different reactions to Twitter's decision in terms of the current U.S. president's Twitter account. Different reactions in terms of that balance between freedom of speech and potentially spread of misinformation. Sarah, I guess during an election, there's no more important time for people to feel that they can express themselves, whatever their views are. And the idea used to be that voters will decide what's right and what's wrong based on that. So, any comments in terms of this balance between freedom of speech and combating misinformation during elections?
Sure. Well, and I think Owen very eloquently outlined how delicate that balance is, of course. And so for all of the good fortune that we have in Canada with respect to the Charter, it does mean, of course, that Canadians do have that right to express themselves, and they have a right to lie. And so I just, maybe just to pick up on Owen's point with respect to to tools, I think that if we get back to sort of that issue of the ecosystem, there are roles for each of those players in that ecosystem to use the tools that they have at their disposal. And from the federal government's perspective, I think that we look to sort of some of the best practices, whether it's Germany or other countries, so that we can say, well, what will work in the Canadian context? So when there is sort of trending issues that are disinformation, how can we flood the information space with accurate and helpful information so that citizens are able to rely on those facts to be able to make an informed decision? How can we, for example, focus on process issues? So Neil, you mentioned during an election. So that means like underscoring the mechanics and the procedures relating to elections. So that, and we saw a little bit of this in the United States, where citizens were told how they could get their ballots for early mail-in ballots, so that you inform them with facts that are more procedure-based as opposed to issues-based. And indeed, we also have to be conscious too about being too proactive with respect to this, because sometimes then that gives additional sort of space and amplification to disinformation. So there's also a balance to be struck there as well. So all in all, a very challenging sort of environment to navigate, but one I think that we're certainly doing our best to be able to move around in.
Thank you. Another learner is asking the question that says, quite a few of the initiatives that have been described by you have to do with the important work of reducing disinformation, that is, reducing a negative. The question is, could you speak a bit about positive measures that could help in building and promoting trust? So Sarah, maybe starting with you, rather than sort of combating the negative, what are the things that we could be doing or should be doing to build and promote trust in a more proactive way?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned a few of those, but I think certainly getting out there and putting accurate information in that space is one way to do that. And what we learned through a lot of the work that we did with our Paris Call partners, so Microsoft and the Alliance for Securing Democracy, was that working with partners, particularly in the community, is important. And Owen also alluded to this, where, for example, we choose our partners carefully, but we engage at the local or community level through programs like the DCI in an effort to be able to sort of understand the issues that are relevant to those particular communities, and to be able to provide information that helps them make informed decisions at their local community level, which helps inform sort of in the broader picture as well. So, I think that there's a number of ways that we can do that, but it's true. It's finding sort of redirecting that negative into something that's empowering for people, where they feel that they're armed and they're equipped to be able to make sort of sound fact-based decisions.
Great. Owen, how about you? I mean, you've got a few policy levers at your disposal as you described.
Yeah, I think it's I guess I query whether it's ever actually about, removing, like, I guess I like to think about the work that we're trying to do. It's not so much about kind of, oh, somebody has stated this, we think it's wrong, and therefore we need to kind of state the counterfactual, but rather I think actually trying to, trying to think about, who are the organizations or people that, we trust, right? And so I think in many instances it's about, again, tapping into people are going to, like, the goal is not to be the thought police, right? And the reality is the internet will be constantly full of contradictory pieces of information and counterclaims, right? And so at the end of the day, we each have to make a determination of what we believe to be true or what we believe to be false, and we all have people or organizations that we kind of fall back on to help us make those decisions, right? And so I think the strategy has got to be about tapping into those networks and those organizations that people trust, and what are the bridging, the term that comes to mind is bridging organizations. There was I think it was a study out of MIT a couple years back, and what they did is they mapped, it was a visualization exercise, and they mapped kind of the Twitter fire hose coming out of the 2016 presidential election, and it got a fair bit of media coverage. There was a lot of talk about kind of tribes in America, right? And what it kind of showed is there was a Republican tribe, there was a Hillary tribe, and there was a Bernie tribe on Twitter, and they didn't talk to each other, right? And so, one of the hypotheses coming out of that study was actually kind of who are the voices? Because, the interesting part of that study was also they mapped kind of some of the main kind of media outlets on there. And in the States, I don't think this surprises anybody, but even the media outlets were not kind of bridging those tribes, right? The media outlets were essentially preaching to their tribe, right? And so, my recollection is one of the hypotheses coming out of that kind of MIT work was like, how do you actually identify who the voices are, who the organizations are that are able to bridge those tribes, for lack of a better word, right? Who are able to reach across and say, well, here's the perspective of your neighbor who has, a very different worldview, than you do. And, here are their, legitimate concerns and worries that, are driving them to act or behave in that way. Right. And so, again, we haven't kind of ever articulated it like that, but I think a little bit of again, the DCI is thinking about, what are those organizations that, obviously are committed to thinking about like what responsible public health information is, right? But, aren't Health Canada or aren't Ottawa Public Health or kind of the local health board, right? But rather that organization who has that relationship with that local community, and people are going to say, I know them, like they're part of my community. I know who they are, and I'm, going to be naturally more inclined to give some weight to kind of what they say.
Cool. By the way, do you know of anyone in Canada that's doing that kind of Twitter analysis for Canadian tribes or, voices?
So there's been some efforts. One of the partnerships we have in the Digital Citizen Initiative is with the Public Policy Forum, and they did some work coming out of the federal election with McGill, the public policy, Maxwell School at McGill. And my recollection, Sarah, is that they have actually, acquired, a fair bit of data coming out of that federal election, and are looking at some of these issues and in partnership with various researchers.
That's my understanding as well.
Yeah, really interesting. And of course, we have the different linguistic groups in Canada and the different immigrant communities, which will give a different complexion, I assume. Really interesting. The next question here is kind of dealing with taking on the conspiracy theorists. So let me see if I can capture this question right. But how do we address people who honestly believe that government and traditional media narratives are untrue and aimed at controlling citizens? So these people, instead that when they see true information found on certain sites and sources, they say that they're sharing the truth that's being hidden from the public. So the question, the typical media literacy tools and education for identifying factual information is simply dismissed by these people since they believe that the truth is found in these sites that they're digging up. The hidden truth or the conspiracy behind. So I don't know, Sarah, if you want to take a first stab at that, and then Owen.
Sure. I mean, it's a really significant challenge. But to Owen's point as well, we're never going to be able to convince everybody as to, believing in what the facts are. There is always going to be sort of all kinds of information that circulates, and particularly now on social media. And I think sort of the best way that we can try and tackle that, of course, is to be able to, as we've said, work with trusted local communities that have long-standing relationships with citizens in their area, to make sure that factual information is easily and readily available to Canadians. But changing people's mind, I mean, I think the research shows that, you debunking this kind of information, if someone has already sort of ingested and believes it, putting a fact in front of them is not going to change their minds. So you have to work with those individuals and that information that you do have, recognizing that there's always going to be sort of dissenting views, and on some issues there is a right and a wrong, and it's not just a question of, well, let's try and find that happy medium or that middle. And that's just a reality, I think, that we need to work with.
I feel like starting a conspiracy website that public servants are just trying to do the right thing and make the country a better place. Owen, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say that, I think we should be cautious about painting it all with a broad brush, right? I think, there may be very legitimate concerns or fears that folks have that underpin some of that skepticism about government, right? We haven't walked in their shoes, and so we, partly we don't know what their experience has been with government, right? We also, again, don't know necessarily what's motivating that, right? So I think it's the biggest challenge we have, I think, particularly as we head into a time where we know that there's going to be, vaccine hesitancy and folks worried about that and worried about kind of what information do I believe, right? But I think, what we need to focus on again is, I think, having the conversations with people about, okay, my boss always talks about appreciative inquiry, right? Asking why, why is it that, you're skeptical of that, or why do you distrust that piece of information? Because I think, if you can start to kind of unpack what perhaps some of the root causes are of that skepticism, I mean, I'm a naturally optimistic, hopeful person, then it allows you potentially, again, to kind of have a strategy for responding to what may be at the root cause of that, right? So again, maybe it's they've had a terrible experience, maybe a terrible experience with government, right? Or with government exercising a force or authority in a way that they deemed inappropriate or unacceptable, right? And so it just allows you then to say, okay, well, here's going to be our strategy for reaching folks who again, maybe very legitimately don't trust government, right? I think the wrong response the wrong response from my perspective is, again, to fall back on, okay, well, we're the experts, we know our public health advice is right, and these people should just believe it because we say it's true, right? Like it's going to be a lot more heavy lifting to actually, I think, have the conversations. And again, it may not be us who's able to have that conversations with them, but actually tap into organizations who are able to have those conversations and say, well, you know what, this community is really skeptical of this because of this, and therefore we need a kind of different kind of approach.
Yeah, and I think as public servants, we're trained to listen to experts, and it's the technocratic instinct in us, I'm sure, about bringing the best expertise to bear. But that doesn't appeal to everyone. In fact, we have one question. Sarah, I'll ask you to start, but do you have any suggestions for talking to friends and family members about misinformation and digital literacy? So riffing a bit on Owen's remarks, do you have any advice for talking to friends and family?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because these are indeed the kind of conversations nowadays that if we could gather friends and family together around a table that would be topics of discussion. I think certainly it's something that I talk to my kids about as well, because I have a 13-year-old daughter, and so she's increasingly becoming more literate and on social media. And so some of the tips or tricks, I guess, that that I suggest are things like, what do you think the motivation is behind the person that is sending you this or that is writing it? Is the motivation altruistic, or is there sort of, potentially sort of a malicious motivation behind it? Check your sources. Who is it that's sending this to you? Do you know that person, or have you heard of them? Is it sort of a more mainstream reputable, or perhaps less mainstream but reputable, or not? And I think too, often what we're seeing now, and we saw this really play out most recently in the US, is, the platforms are increasingly playing a role with respect to tagging posts, so that they actually then do link you to other sources of information, so that you can sort of check against other sources to sort of determine the validity. So those are just sort of 3 tips and tricks that certainly I utilize, and I encourage my kids and my family to utilize as well. But there's lots more as well.
Oh, and I know your daughter is not quite that media literate age. Any other advice for talking to friends and family?
Well, I guess I divided into two categories, right? Like, I think the question could speak to both. In an instance where, like, you may be talking to someone who, again, may not just understand that, what they read on Facebook isn't necessarily true, right? And so it may just be about, again, in a non-judgmental way, talking about, the power of these tools is that it allows all of us to communicate directly with one another, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person sharing that, knows it to be true or not. So it's incumbent on all of us to kind of, ask ourselves, be a little bit of a skeptic and say, do I really think that's true or not? I think the question can also speak to the second category, though. It's like, what do you do if you have a family member or a friend who you feel, is in that skeptic category, and, maybe, hesitant about, trusting in, what you consider to be authoritative sources. And I think, that's the tricky situation again. I think appreciative inquiry goes a long way about just, I think we need to, leave judgment at the door and just give people a lot of grace in some of these situations, and just, ask questions about, like, again, why do you, like, what is it that, why do you believe that? I also think have the conversation face to face, right? Like, I think it's so much harder to ignore the human elements of these problems when you have to sit across from someone, or, look in their eyes and appreciate that, again, there's kind of a lived experience behind that. And I think, study after study has shown kind of some of the dehumanizing aspects of digital technologies that allow us, again, to be, whatever term you want to use, the keyboard warrior or whatever, but, to avoid those kind of situations, right? Like if you truly care about somebody, you'll I like to believe we'll go to the effort of, again, having that face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice from both of you. I admit when somebody, say, is a climate skeptic or, has alternate facts in another area, sometimes it's hard to argue one's case or my case because I'm really not an expert in climate science and I'm really not a public health expert. So sometimes the amount of research I need to do to substantiate my position is also pretty high. And not everyone is an expert in all, or nor can they be an expert in all the many areas that we do. So at a certain point we do have to be trusting. We do have a question from the audience though about flipping the question about having too much trust or maybe even blind trust or gullibility. Are the strategies for fighting distrust the same as fighting blind trust? Would either of you like to take a stab at that? Sarah?
Sure. Very, very interesting question. I mean, I think, what comes to mind for me is whether it's blind trust or mistrust, skepticism and curiosity. I think, and curiosity is maybe sort of the optimistic angle to skepticism. Curiosity in sort of understanding and a little bit to sort of some of Owen's points as well, unpacking some of these issues, unpacking sort of the rationale of, why different perspectives or individuals feel the way they do and have the views that they share. So I think that sort of natural curiosity and encouraging sort of a diversity of views, a diversity of information sources. To me, those all fit in both cases. It's really an effort to be as informed as you possibly can to understand sort of who the reliable sources of that information are. And I think in some respects, sort of blind trust maybe not quite as damaging, but there's certainly risks with that as well. So, I'm sure there are tools that don't work in both cases, but those are sort of some of the approaches that to me seem to fit in either scenario.
Super. Owen?
Yeah, I would say, I think it can be just as big of a problem as, the reverse, right? And so, I remember, again, when we were first kind of wrapping our minds around, this phenomenon, like back then, it was, one big vector was, Facebook groups where you had a lot of, more middle-aged people not necessarily kind of understanding, what it was that they were sharing because they I'm sorry, I'm losing my earphone here. They trusted that source too blindly, right? And so I do think in both cases it comes back to like what we're trying to equip citizens is be discerning consumers of information, right? And I think also a message of like our understanding of a particular problem or issue is never perfect, right? And I think one of the ways we can guard against, I guess, polarization in these spaces is keeping our minds open, right? To that the science will continue to evolve, the information will continue to evolve. And so if you lock in your view based on, your understanding in a particular moment in time, at a certain point, you actually risk perhaps being offside again, kind of, a true understanding based on kind of what we know, right? So it's I think constantly kind of challenging ourselves, and that's something I struggle with, like, because I think we have, in government, when you're in a policy space, you kind of, you write the note at a moment in time, and then it's kind of, okay, well, that's our view on that. And I think, it's incumbent on everybody to, again, say, okay, well, the space is going to change and it's going to evolve, and we may need to reevaluate actually some of those conclusions that we came to.
Super. So I mentioned in passing sort of the Twitter self-regulation, but someone in a question has asked for more comments. So could either of you comment on the role of social media and the power to censor, and if you have any views or policy points that you would make around sort of the role of social media companies and censorship?
I can start if you'd like, Neil. So, I mean, this is a fascinating space, and I think that a month ago we might not have ever anticipated that the big platforms like Twitter and Facebook would take the kind of action that we saw them take in the U.S. context, for example. And so, we talk about sort of the need to be flexible and to adapt to changing circumstances. I think that this is a really sort of key example of why that's important, because the space does evolve so quickly. And sort of with respect to sort of the sort of that policy context from the DI Secretariat perspective, in advance of the 2019 general election, the Government of Canada negotiated with 4 of the major platforms, so Twitter, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. And the Government of Canada and those 4 platforms bought into a voluntary code of conduct or declaration for online integrity that was really centered around 3 key principles: transparency, authenticity, and integrity. And part of that now, was really sort of aimed at ensuring that the social media platforms took action in that disinformation space. And so that was one tool that we had at our disposal. But again, some of the challenges are that the context evolves very, very quickly. And what the expectations were of the social media platforms back in 2018, 2019, we've seen that, much to our surprise, the action that they've taken is a lot more significant than perhaps what we might have anticipated they would ever do even a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they used to hide behind the shield of common carrier, Owen, and now that seems to have changed. Any comments from your point of view?
So I think it's been fascinating to watch what's going on south of the border for sure. And I think in many respects, right, what we're seeing is, immediately after the decision to deactivate, the president's, for one more day, account on a number of platforms, right? I mean, it wasn't long, before immediately you saw, in the media, kind of the
Very entertaining. We'll let Owen deal with his life matter. Are you back with us, Owen?
There, yeah. I think what was, so interesting is immediately you saw kind of the debate spring up about, obviously, folks saying this was long overdue, right? And, applauding that decision. But then immediately, there being a counter narrative about, but, what is the appropriate role of these platforms in making these decisions, and what's the oversight of these decisions, right? And are they making these decisions in a way that is consistent, right? So immediately you had criticism, okay, so you've now deplatformed the US president, but you have, other world leaders who are, doing similar type of action, and yet you haven't deplatformed them, right? And so I think it raises really hard policy questions, and I think it boils down to, and what you're seeing, I think, on the part of many Western governments, is at least a indication that what we need to start is a conversation about kind of what the expectations of free and democratic societies are with respect to, social media companies, and kind of what will be the oversight of decision making, right? And so again, I think the work that we're doing with respect to online hate and illegal content is a first step in that direction, about there being an articulation at a societal level that we think it's inappropriate for companies to host this kind of material, or facilitate its distribution, right? And will be oversight of that. And I think we're going to have that conversation in other areas as well, right? And I think that's a nascent conversation that is cropping up, and including in the U.S., as you alluded to, Neil, like there a huge debate raging about section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and does it need to be revisited, and those kind of things.
And if I could just jump in, Neil, with sort of one other comment related to that as well. I think that, certainly what we've seen in the US with the deplatforming of President Trump is sort of the emergence of smaller platforms and private messaging, and how some of these these platforms are gaining traction as well. And so how do we keep our eye on what we anticipate as being around the corner, in addition to obviously sort of all of the big tech issues as well?
And I think it's a really important piece too, because, having we also need to remember, you can deplatform, to use the term, but it actually hasn't really addressed the root issue, right? That, again, you have this kind of huge cleavage in, society around some of these issues, right? And so, the tech regulation piece is an important piece, but actually at the end of the day, it comes back kind of the root of this conversation is about how do we build trustful, cohesive societies, right? And that's got to involve more than just kind of the tech regulation lever. It's got to think about, what are we doing in the space of arts and culture, so that we appreciate kind of each other? What are we doing in the space of, local community outreach? What are we doing in the space of public security interventions to counter radicalization and those kind of things, right? There's so many different levers there that have to be part of the way we think about this, because, you can shut down Parler's back up and running now via servers out of Russia. It's my understanding, right? The problem will just continue to migrate. I mean, that's, for better and worse, that's the power of the internet, is that, it will continue to try to find a way. So, you've actually got to lean into the much harder problem about why did we have the riots in Washington, and how do we address, again, some of the root problems underneath that?
Yeah, it does sound a lot like whack-a-mole, in the sense that it's constant use of different instruments, and constantly staying up to speed to deal with the issue. I remember when I was at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and when we were working on some health-related initiatives, we had a detect and correct function between our policy folks and our communications folks, to try to detect misinformation, not so much disinformation, I don't think, but misinformation, and then to correct it as soon as possible through comms channels. But government is famously slow, so it's not always government that can or should do that. It's some of the other parties. We have a question here about special special groups that we need to think about. So, I think both of you have said that this is not a monolithic solution. Society is not homogenous, and we should not treat it that way. But so the question is, what steps can policymakers take to rebuild trust in those who have valid reasons for mistrust in government and health advice? And the example that's given is Indigenous groups who have had subject to forced sterilization, potentially in some areas, as well as many other health-related injustices on the part of the government. So how do we get at some of those? So Owen, maybe start with you this time, and then Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's a question that speaks to, what I was trying to get to, that, there may be very valid reasons why somebody is skeptical about government action or intervention. And, I think that example is a very potent one, right? And so, again, it just, and this falls on, the public service to really think about, so what is going to be our nuanced, vaccination strategy in the case of the example that was given, to reach out to those populations where, the quote, like mainstream approach where you kind of invite them to show up at a mass clinic isn't going to work, right? So who are the partners that we need to work with in Indigenous communities, who will have that bond of trust, right? And it actually can be, we need to, I would say, adopt a position of humility going into that conversation about listening to them in terms of, how they would approach the problem, right? I guess that's my thought on that one, Sarah.
Yeah, a very difficult question, and I think Owen sort of approached it from a higher level. From my perspective, if I'm looking to build trust, whether it's in a community or an individual, I think about, well, what can I do as one individual, as one public servant, recognizing that I'm a part of a greater whole, and things like be true to my word, follow through to the extent that I can, provide well-balanced sort of perspective, and listen and understand to the perspective and the views of others. And so it's really sort of around having, for me anyways, personally, when I'm trying to sort of regain or maintain trust, having that respectful relationship, and upholding for me, and sort of those highest values. So sort of taking it more as in terms of how I would personally approach a situation like that.
Thank you both. So we've talked about different partners, community level partners, municipal, First Nations, and other Indigenous partners. What about provinces and territories? There's a question here: to what extent can the federal government encourage provinces to invest more in standards, civic education, and media literacy for all students? And is there a sound use of the federal spending power in this area? So maybe Sarah, we'll let you take that first.
Sure. Although I think really with the Digital Citizen Initiative and the work that's been going on there, Owen will have some great things to say. Certainly I can say from sort of a federal, provincial, territorial engagement space within the democratic institutions, Secretariat, we, with Elections Canada, work very closely with the electoral bodies in the provinces and the territories. They are key partners in many ways for us, particularly given, in the current COVID context with jurisdictional issues around health and education. And so those partnerships are really key. I think as well that we have some, often we have resources at the federal level with respect to, say, our security agencies and monitoring and detecting foreign interference that they don't necessarily have at the provincial and territorial level. So ensuring that that collaboration in that particular space is strong is also really important.
Great. Owen?
Yeah, I think the question, alludes to the fact that indeed the provinces and territories have a huge stake in this, and a huge powerful lever in terms of being responsible for education. It's been on our radar for a while that this is probably an area that is actually ripe for a more robust federal, provincial, territorial discussion. And so that is something that I think we continue to reflect on. What I would say is, part of what we have done through the DCI, including in the election context, is work with organizations who at the provincial level have very strong relationships in place with the ministries of education, right? So I think of an organization like Civic, for example, that runs, the student vote campaign in high schools, right? Designed to, again, teach students about, democratic participation and how you, learn about, information in your local community that will help you make an informed kind of political choice, right? So that is one organization that we have supported in terms of some of the work that they're doing to equip teachers and educators, right? And they have very strong relationships in place generally with most provincial education ministries. But I would acknowledge that I do think it would be worth, I guess, a more robust, I think, dialogue at some point, because I think we all bring various things to the table that we can deploy, and I'm not sure actually we have fully kind of thought about kind of some of the tools that our provincial counterparts have at their disposal.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think sometimes I feel like I am in a civics lesson during an election or with big policy issues, that basically it is basic factual information, or at least information about trusted intermediaries that's being disseminated, which is not that different than basic civic education. So we've covered a lot of topics, and it feels like the future is here in terms of the different pressures that we face, the different policy issues that you both are grappling with, and the different instruments we're using. But if I could ask you to forecast into the future, if you think about the future challenges facing, in your case, Owen, the Digital Citizen Initiative, if you think about what kind of future challenges you see in terms of disinformation over the next year, and what you think some of the next areas for action might be. And then I'll turn to you after, Sarah, and ask you the same question in terms of the democratic institutions, Secretariat, and agenda, and how you see that evolving over time, and what are some things that you each are watching for in your space down the road. So Owen, starting with you.
Yeah, it's a hard question, and one I confess, like I kind of still feel like we're trying to catch our breath. The last, we're coming up to a year. It's been a crazy ride, I guess. So one thing, I mean, it's kind of mundane, but the Digital Citizen Initiative isn't a permanent program right now. So it was put in place for 4 years in budget 2019. And, we are thinking about like just the kind of results story, right? Which I, don't want to lose sight of in terms of, when I started, I talked about, I often describe it as hoping to kind of establish a bit of a virtuous circle between constantly improving our understanding of, how disinformation spreads and the techniques and tools that are used to spread it, and then better calibrating our kind of interventions, but not we, the royal we, our interventions as a society in response to those, right? And I think, we need to, put that story down on paper and capture it as we go forward in terms of giving advice on whether we think, the program should be extended and those kind of things. So that's something. As I said, like I think a little bit the the next frontier is a bit unknown, right? I think that is one of our big lessons. I mean, there will be recurring things that Sarah has talked about, like we know we will have an election at some point in the next little bit. You know, anyone's guess is as good as ours, but it will come at a certain point. And obviously, you know, it's an opportunity to, again, talk about the importance of people, you know, challenging themselves to think about what's true, what's not true, how do they know it's true, etc. But beyond that, like, I think what the next frontier of the strategic opportunity to drive, you know, or so kind of distrust, I don't really know necessarily what that will be. And I do think, you know, our conversation a little bit about censorship and what's happening south of the border does, you know, we're going to have to wrestle with, like, how do we walk that between, again, promoting kind of a safe and inclusive place online, while also being true to, you know, fostering debate and you know, disagreement and you know, being comfortable with that. So it's not a very good answer, but a bit of a muddled one.
Would you like to add to it, Sarah?
Sure. You know, and I think the trick here is, and I'll pick up on sort of some of the threads that we've talked about, and that is, you know, no matter what that kind of next big issue is or what we anticipate around the corner, is to be flexible and adaptable and look at all of the different levers that we have at our disposal. And I think that, you know, that was one of the elements that made the Protecting Democracy plan that was put in place in advance of the last federal election so successful. It was comprised of 4 different pillars. You know, one was sort of empowering citizens, or citizen resilience, which we've talked a lot about with the Digital Citizen Initiative. It was also improving organizational readiness, so that organizations are primed and sort of strengthened in their security practices. The third pillar was around foreign interference. And so through specific dedicated measures, making it clear, you know, like ensuring that there was a whole of government effort to identify threats and vulnerabilities in our system. And the fourth pillar was around, you know, as I mentioned, the declaration and getting social media platforms to act. And so I think that, you know, based on the evaluations that were undertaken of that particular plan, it was found to be successful. And so let's make sure that as we look to what could come next, is that we also recognize what has worked in the past, why it worked, and so where does that tweaking and those adjustments need to be made? And so I think that, you know, as we've talked about, what we saw coming out of the US was, you know, the focus on foreign interference. We're also seeing that we can't ignore sort of other sources of origin for that kind of disinformation. So how do we address that in a way that balances the rights and freedoms of Canadians? And I think, too, as we talked about as well, another space, and without having a crystal ball, is, you know, that evolution of the social media platforms and what role they play and should play while striking that balance. And so, you know, obviously the fact that we are in a minority context, and so we don't have a fixed state election, weighs heavily on us, because one thing is for sure, that we want to ensure that we do everything we can to be prepared no matter when the next election might be.
Yeah, interesting. I guess that's a different situation for us in Canada to be ready for. Also, I suppose the US will take policy actions over the next year and more in this space, as will other governments. You mentioned Germany, but around the world. So this will be a really dynamic space to watch, to see the different approaches that are taken, and to see how they're successful or not. So really exciting policy area. I have a question here, which is for you as leaders. And the question is how do you embody trust on your team? Do you think about embedding values into leadership, as some have suggested, as a remedy to the perception of government as trustworthy or not? So basically, how do you embody trust in your leadership approach and in your team? Sarah, do you want to start, and then Owen?
Sure. In many respects, it's like a little microcosm of what we do outside of our teams. And for me, in my role, I really work hard to try to empower my team, share information with them. And I think that what I've found is, particularly in the current context of having to work remotely, all of that contextual sort of proverbial around the water cooler conversations don't happen anymore. And so unless people ask questions, it's very difficult to get information because the context has changed so drastically. And so I work particularly hard at sharing information. And I think in many respects, that's what we do with our community organizations and with Canadians as well. I also want to make sure that their views and perspectives are heard. And, to sort of some of Owen's points, understand sort of what those diversity of perspectives are and then integrate that. And I think probably one of the most important is to lead by example. And, if my team has confidence in me and they see that, I'm leading with example, or by example, I should say, then I think that goes a long way in terms of building a team that has trust. I think, though, in many respects, I'm very fortunate because we are a small team, so it means that we can share information, we can have those conversations in a more horizontal manner than perhaps others can in different organizations. But embodying trust and having that trust in your team is critical for success, in my view.
Thanks, Sarah. Owen?
I could say ditto. I guess, perhaps what I would just add is, and this is based on my own experience as a public servant, that, I have been fortunate to have really great bosses who have provided me, opportunity to, to have an impact. And so, I guess my observation is trust usually begets trust, right? And so it's a two-way street. So I think the biggest thing, we can do to foster trust within the public service is, as Sarah said, like empower one another, right? That because just speaking from personal experience, like, when somebody has trusted me to whatever brief the minister, in turn, I feel like, that I am being provided with, incredible opportunity and a privilege. And I feel like my boss is in my corner, right? And so I think the empowerment piece is really key. And I think, unfortunately, too often, we kind of can fall back into kind of that hierarchical pyramid type scheme where we're not kind of, I think, seizing the power of kind of harnessing everybody's collective genius, so to speak. And then the second piece is like, and I think this is so critical in the current times that we're living, like part of our role is to be the buffer, right? And so part of it is folks feeling like, you will advocate and fight for when it's too much. That is part of it, right? I mean, if they sense that you're not in their corner, or you blow whichever way the wind blows, I think, not likely to trust. My last point though would be, I think a reminder, trust obviously within the public service is critical, but it doesn't necessarily, like, I think it's also about, as we've talked about, like, you've got to build trust with the partners that you're working with in whatever field or department it is outside the public service as well, right? Because I think one of the big risks we face as an institution is, again, a perception of, being an ivory tower closeted up, disconnected from reality, disconnected from, what Main Street is living, so to speak. And so it really is critical for us to have those relationships in place with the constituents who we're there to serve at the end of the day.
Fantastic advice. Sarah, do you have any advice for public servants? Maybe they're in a program or a service context or in a policy context. They may or may not be working on the hot file of the day, or they may be, but do you have any basic advice for, as Owen says, dealing with stakeholders and eliciting trust in that context?
Sure. And I mean, you know, I'm not in program delivery now, but I spent many years in program delivery. And one of the things that I found personally served me well in those roles was being true to delivering what I said I would deliver. You know, being forthright, not committing more than what than what I felt I could. Timely, so delivering on time, getting back to people when you say you're going to get back to them. Sort of very, very basic sort of practices, I would suggest, that then they know they can rely on you. So it's a sense of confidence. Well, Sarah says she's going to get back to me by tomorrow with X, Y, and Z. Sarah gets back to you tomorrow with X, Y, and Z. Because unfortunately, you can do that 9 times. And if you miss the 10th, you sort of have to start over again. And so there is a bit of an investment, but it pays off because it's reciprocated in my experience. And once you have that kind of sort of very high functioning, trusting relationship, yeah, you can do great things with partners.
Well, this, of course, trust is primordial. Maybe I could just bring it back to misinformation and disinformation and ask each of you to kind of give us your closing thoughts about the state of the Government of Canada's work with partners to counter misinformation and disinformation. And if you'd like to leave us with any thoughts, that would be great. And I will also say that we will send out some of the websites you guys referred to, whether it's the Digital Citizen Initiative or the Democratic Institutions website. We'll send those links out afterwards. But if there's any other closing thoughts you want to make, Owen, over to you and then to Sarah.
Well, thanks, Neil. I've really enjoyed the conversation. A little weird not to see the faces on the other end of it. Sarah and I were talking about that beforehand. You know, I think Sarah referenced, Edelman at the beginning, and, the fact that, Canada at least got a moderate bump in terms of the last results, although I think we're still kind of in the neutral category. I don't think we kind of make it into the trusted category. I think that's, a caution for us that, we shouldn't take trust for granted, right? Our previous Governor General always spoke so eloquently about kind of the importance of trust. And I think, I guess I am hopeful. Again, I'm generally optimistic, but I think, the public service does have a really privileged position to try and foster trust through the programs that we administer and the relationships we have. And I think as you kind of alluded to, Neil, that starts at an individual level and then flows out from that, right? So I don't think I have any, as we talked about, I think, and when we were prepping for this call, Neil said, like, I think there's no silver bullet to these problems. And I think Sarah said that too, right? And I think it's about being in a state of vigilance and thinking about, again, each of us has a sphere of influence, and be creative about how you use that sphere of influence to advance these issues, right? And again, like I'm so proud of my team, for what I think they saw as an opportunity, and they drove that, right? Like I think, of course, obviously at the end of the day, the DM and the minister had the final decisions, but it was them who said, okay, well, we actually have this program and we can do something here, and we're going to pitch an idea and see where it goes, right? And so that came from public servants, right? And so I think that speaks to, again, the privilege we're given, but also the power that we have in terms of, not waiting, I guess, to necessarily be asked.
Fantastic. Thank you, Owen. Sarah.
From my perspective, just to say, I absolutely agree with everything Owen has just said, and I might only add how important the relationships are in all of that as well. And so I know we've talked a lot about partnerships, but it really does in many ways boil down to the relationships that the desk officers have among themselves across the various departments and with the security agencies and with our community partners and with the provinces and the territories, and the relationships that we have at our, in the work that we do as well. And so to make sure that we nurture those, it's an absolute privilege, as Owen says, to be able to work on these particular issues and to have teams that are thoughtful and creative, with a really clear, sort of sphere of influence. But let's make sure that through those partnerships and those relationships that we sort of connect all of those spheres of influence so that we can kind of adapt together and we can sort of have as many levers as possible to address some of these challenges going forward.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. Thank you for your perspectives. Thank you for the great information that you have shared. We really appreciate you being here with us today, and we've really enjoyed having you here. I'd also like to thank all the participants for attending today's event. I hope you enjoyed the event. I hope you were inspired and you learned something new. Votre rétroaction est très...
Your feedback is very important to us. So I encourage you in filling the electronic assessment that you should receive over the coming days. The school has many other events to offer you, so I encourage you in regularly consulting the website of the school so that you're aware of current affairs and that you can register to more training sessions.
I invite you to check it out and to attend. So once again, thank you to everyone and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye.